All right, so you know how it is, right? You're super curious about some new thing, something groundbreaking. You really want to wrap your head around it. But, sifting through all the info out there feels like climbing a mountain.
Yeah, totally get that.
It's a lot.
Absolutely. And, what you've stumbled upon today is a pretty wild story.
It is. We're diving into the de-extinction of the dire wolf.
De-extinction, that's a powerful phrase.
It is, and it's thanks to a company called Colossal Biosciences.
Now, I'm sure some people listening have heard of Colossal. They've been making headlines for a while now. But today, we've got a really in-depth article from Time magazine that really gets into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, it does, and that's what we're going to unpack together, so the science behind it all, really what's driving this whole project, and I think some really big questions that it raises, for all of us about life on Earth, really.
Big questions indeed. Speaking of life on Earth, the article starts with some pretty mind-blowing news.
Yeah.
The pups are here.
They are.
Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi. 3 of them. And we're not talking about your typical adorable fluffy puppies.
Oh, no.
At just 6 months old, the male pups are already around 4 feet long and weigh about 80 pounds.
Wow, that's bigger than a lot of dog breeds, full-grown dog breeds.
It is, and the article makes it clear. Their behavior, pure wild wolf. They keep their distance. They show very little interest in human affection. It's a stark reminder of what we're actually talking about here. Bringing back a creature that walked this planet over 10,000 years ago.
Yeah, it really hits home, It's like a blast from the past.
It really is. And what I find so fascinating is the absolute ingenuity of the science that made this possible. Colossal Biosciences, they're not just digging up fossils. They're actually extracting ancient DNA and using it to, you could say, reshape the genetic makeup of the gray wolf.
That's wild.
Isn't it? And they focused on the key things that made the dire wolf so unique. Its size, obviously. That striking coat color we see in Romulus and Remus, the very structure of their skull, even their teeth and how they vocalize, all of that was encoded in that ancient DNA.
It's incredible to me, You hear the words genetic engineering and it sounds so complex.
Oh, it is.
But the article mentions something that really struck me. They only needed about 20 genetic edits across just 14 genes of the gray wolf to bring back those dire wolf traits.
20 edits?
20 edits. That, to me, seems shockingly few given how much time separates them.
You're right. It's a surprisingly small number. And that just shows you the power of these key regulatory genes.
Yeah.
Tiny tweaks that can lead to huge changes in an animal's physical form.
It makes you wonder, right? Like how evolution can sometimes take these massive leaps instead of just tiny steps.
It really does. Now, where did they get this ancient DNA? Well, the sources are pretty incredible in themselves. We're talking about a 13,000-year-old tooth discovered in a place called Sheridan Pit in Ohio.
Wow.
And a 72,000-year-old ear bone from American Falls, Idaho.
So you're telling me that these tiny fragments held the blueprint for an animal that hasn't existed for millennia?
That's exactly right.
That's mind-blowing.
It is. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, how do you even get usable DNA from something that old?
I am, yeah.
Well, ancient DNA is often fragmented. It's degraded.
Right.
Scientists have had to come up with some pretty amazing technique to piece those fragments back together. Imagine a jigsaw puzzle, but with some of the pieces missing.
Oh, wow.
The fact that they could get enough information from these specimens to guide the whole editing process, that speaks volumes about the advancements we've made in genomic sequencing and analysis.
It really does. And then there's the method they use to actually bring these pups to life, right? Which is also pretty cutting edge.
It is. They didn't go with the traditional cloning that we saw with Dolly the sheep, which used a tissue sample. Instead, they went with something called endothelial progenitor cells, EPCs for short. And these were derived from gray wolf blood.
Right. And the article suggests that this is a less invasive approach. So help me understand that.
Well, imagine this. It's less like taking a big chunk of ancient DNA and just sticking it in.
Okay.
It's more about making very precise edits to the existing DNA of the gray wolf.
Right.
They're basically guiding those gray wolf genes to express themselves in a way that matches the dire wolf.
Like turning certain switches on and off.
Exactly. And it's all about the phenotype, the physical characteristics like size and fur color.
So these EPCs, these are cells that line the blood vessels, right?
That's right. And they're much easier to get to than other types of cells.
Makes sense.
So the scientists made those 20 edits, those crucial edits, within the nuclei of these EPCs.
Okay.
Now, here's the thing. They weren't directly putting in ancient dire wolf DNA, all right?
Right.
They were reprogramming the gray wolf DNA to align with those ancient instructions.
Clever. So these edited nuclei were then put into, what are they called? Enucleated ova.
Yes, enucleated ova, which are basically eggs that have had their own nucleus removed,
Okay.
and then those developed into embryos, and those embryos were then implanted into surrogate mothers.
And the surrogate mothers were hound mixes, right?
You got it. Chosen partly because of their size.
Makes sense. Take care of those pups.
To term. And that's how we got Romulus and Remus, born in October 2024, and then Khaleesi in January 2025, all delivered via C-section, which was planned to minimize any risks.
Right. And there's this, almost unbelievable story in the article. When the pups were just weeks old, a vet tech was singing a song from, you guessed it, The Little Mermaid.
Of course.
And when she changed the pitch of her voice, Romulus and Remus started howling along.
Isn't that incredible?
It's like a sound that hasn't been heard on Earth for over 10,000 years. Chills.
It gives you goosebumps, doesn't it?
It really does. So, scientifically speaking, what does this mean? They're making these ancient sounds. Does that tell us that this genetic reconstruction is accurate?
It's a strong indication. It suggests that the edits they made have reactivated those vocalization patterns that were characteristic of the dire wolf.
Wow.
Now, we can't know for sure exactly what a dire wolf howl sounded like back then,
Right.
but the fact that these pups are making these distinct wolf-like howls in response to a stimulus, that points to a pretty fundamental level of genetic alignment.
It really does. And it's not just about dire wolves, right? Colossal has even bigger ambitions.
Much bigger. They're aiming for the de-extinction of some other fascinating creatures.
Yeah.
Woolly mammoths, the dodo, the silacine, you name it.
The Tasmanian tiger, right?
That's the one.
I mean, it sounds like something straight out of science fiction.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But here's the thing. It's not just about the spectacle of bringing back these extinct animals.
Right.
Colossal is making the case that the very techniques they're developing, these de-extinction techniques, they could be vital for saving species that are teetering on the brink of extinction today.
So a sort of 1-2 punch?
Exactly. For example, the knowledge they're gaining from the Mammoth Project, that could help us engineer greater resilience into modern elephant populations.
Makes sense.
Helping them cope with climate change and other threats.
Right.
Similarly, research on the thylacine, that could benefit its living relative, the quoll. And as we'll get into later, their work with the dire wolf is directly feeding into their efforts to conserve the red wolf, which is critically endangered.
So it's not just about bringing back the past, it's about using that knowledge to protect the present.
That's a great way to put it. And Beth Shapiro, she's Colossal's chief science officer, she has this really powerful quote in the article. She says that humanity has become, and I'm quoting here, an evolutionary force, and that we have a moral imperative to try and reverse some of the extinctions we've caused.
Yeah, I remember reading that. It's a pretty heavy thought, this idea that we have a responsibility to fix some of the damage we've done.
It is, and they've already had a success with this. They created a woolly mouse, which might sound a bit less traumatic than a dire wolf.
Yeah, a little bit.
But it was a huge step.
Yeah.
It proved that they could actually introduce those specific ancient traits into a living animal using genetic engineering.
So it's not just theory. They've actually done it.
They have. But we've talked a lot about the amazing science, and it is amazing.
Yeah.
But we need to look at the other side of the coin as well. The practical considerations of bringing back extinct animals. And there are some concerns.
For sure. It's not all sunshine and roses.
It isn't. And there are ethical considerations as well. Robert Klitzman, a bioethicist at Columbia, raises some important points about the potential for suffering during the cloning process.
Yeah, that's something we can't ignore.
Absolutely. There are risks of miscarriages, health problems for the surrogate mothers. These are things we need to think about very carefully.
We can't just assume everything will go perfectly, right? It's not like in the movies.
Exactly. And if we look back at history, whenever we've introduced non-native species, there have often been unintended consequences.
Right.
Invasive species disrupting ecosystems.
Sometimes with devastating results.
And genetic engineering, as advanced as it is still relatively new.
Yeah, it's not a perfect science.
We've seen cases with cloned animals like Dolly the sheep, where there were health issues.
Like what sorts of issues?
Larger birth size, problems with organs, even premature aging, and issues with the immune system.
Wow, that's scary.
And as you mentioned, the risks to the surrogate mothers, we can't overlook those.
So it's complex.
Very complex. And then there's the ecological side of things. Rick McIntyre, a leading wolf researcher, points out that dire wolves were specialized predators.
Right.
They mainly hunted megafauna, mammoths, giant bison, animals like that.
Which are long gone.
Extinct.
Mm.
So the question is, what would dire wolves eat in our world today?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Would they be able to adapt to hunting smaller prey? And what impacts would they have on the ecosystems we have now?
Right, would they throw things out of whack?
It's a possibility.
Hmm.
And then there's the whole issue of animal welfare. What about the well-being of these de-extinct animals living in captivity?
Especially if they're social animals.
Exactly. Stephen Latham at Yale, he brings up the example of mammoths. They're very social creatures.
Right, they live in herds.
And he asks, what kind of life can a single mammoth or even a small group have without that complex social structure, without those vast territories they would naturally roam?
It's a good question.
And we're actually seeing some of these questions play out in real time with Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi,
Right, they're living on a preserve now.
a 2,000-acre preserve, which sounds big,
It does.
but it's nothing compared to the territory a wild wolf pack would usually roam.
So are they behaving like wild wolves?
The article says they are showing those wild behaviors, stalking, predatory instincts,
Whoop.
things like that,
Okay.
but they haven't been seen actually hunting live prey.
Interesting.
And Colossal isn't giving them the opportunity to do so.
So they're not on a natural diet.
No, they're being fed a prepared diet.
Hmm.
So even though they have the genes, the instincts of a dire wolf,
Right.
their actual lived experience is very different from a truly wild animal.
It's a controlled environment.
It is. And that brings us to another really interesting part of Colossal's work, which is their efforts to save the red wolf.
Yes, which is a living species that's in a lot of trouble.
Critically endangered.
And this feels like a much more direct link to conservation, like boots on the ground.
It does. The red wolf population has really suffered. Habitat loss, predator control programs,
Humans again.
and it's created this genetic bottleneck. The remaining population is so small and so closely related.
They're all basically cousins.
Exactly. And that lack of genetic diversity, that's leading to problems with fertility, more inherited health issues.
So Colossal's using cloning technology to try and introduce some fresh genes into the mix.
That's right. And they've successfully cloned 4 red wolves so far.
Wow.
And his concept of ghost alleles is pretty fascinating. Apparently, even some wolves that didn't physically look like red wolves,
Right.
they carried hidden red wolf genetic variation.
It's like a secret code hidden in their DNA.
It is. Researchers found these canids in Louisiana and Texas, and they had both coyote genes and these ghost alleles for the red wolf.
So Colossal used these hidden genes to create what they call the first ghost wolf.
A ghost wolf.
And the goal is to breed these cloned wolves with the existing population.
To mix things up, introduce some new genetic variations.
And hopefully give the red wolf a fighting chance.
That's the hope. And unlike the situation with the dire wolves, it seems like there's a real path for these cloned red wolves, or at least their offspring, to actually play a role in conservation efforts in the wild.
Right, to actually be out there helping the population.
Colossal is even talking with authorities in North Carolina about potentially using these cloned animals as a conservation tool.
So a much more immediate impact.
It is. And the article even mentions how this kind of deep genetic understanding could help other endangered species.
Right, like a ripple effect.
For example, they're looking into whether they could make the northern quoll in Australia resistant to cane toad toxins.
Wow, so specific.
It is, and potentially a huge impact for the quoll.
It's incredible how research in one area can lead to these unexpected benefits in other areas.
It really is. And speaking of unexpected, the article also gets into the business side of Colossal Biosciences.
Right, they're a company after all.
And they've got a pretty hefty valuation, over $1 billion.
That's a lot of zeros.
It is. And while the financial returns from bringing back mammoths and dire wolves, well, those are still up in the air.
It's a long game.
But the technologies they're developing, those have huge potential in other areas.
Like what?
They've already spun off companies that are working on things like breaking down plastic waste, using microbes,
So they're tackling pollution.
and using AI for drug discovery.
Wow. So their science is having a real impact in other fields.
Absolutely. It's this fascinating mix of cutting-edge science, conservation goals, and serious business investment,
It really is. And the article does mention other conservation organizations working in this space.
like Revive and Restore, Rewilding Europe.
But Colossal is playing on a different level, it seems like.
They are. And it was interesting to get these little glimpses into Romulus and Remus's personalities during the time visit.
Oh, yeah. What were they like?
Apparently, Romulus was the bolder one, more exploratory.
Okay.
And Remus was more reserved at first, but has gotten more confident as he's grown.
So they have individual personalities like any other dog.
Which makes sense, but it's still cool to see.
It is. So where do things go from here?
Well, the article ends by saying that it's still unclear what will happen with the dire wolves in terms of breeding,
Right.
and that there's interest from the MHA Nation tribes in potentially having them on their lands.
So the story is still unfolding.
It is. It's really an evolving situation.
It's incredible to think that we're bringing back a species that we thought was gone forever.
It is.
I mean, this whole deep dive into the Time article, it just shows the amazing things science can do.
The potential benefits, but also the ethical considerations, the risks.
It's not a simple issue.
No, it's complex. And it really makes you think, as listeners, we've played a huge role in driving so many species to extinction. And now we have this power, this rapidly developing power, to potentially reverse that process. So what does that mean for us?
Yeah, where do we draw the line?
What are our responsibilities?
Yeah.
What are the ethical boundaries? What does the return of the dire wolf and these other projects really tell us about our relationship with nature?
Yeah, it's a lot to ponder.
It really is. And it makes you think about the future of biodiversity on our planet. What role do we want to play? It's a big question.
It is a huge question, a lot to think about there. And I think we've given everyone plenty to chew on today.
We have. It's been a fascinating deep dive.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, this is great. Until next time.